No, it doesn't. The CSS profile is probably the best component that takes into things similar to that. But there's not like a cost of living. One of the questions like on the CSS profile is like, talks about like home equity and things like that. And so that you would like pull up Zillow and find out like how much your house would sell for on the market and stuff like that, which is not great either because most people's, their housing value is like super, super high right now. Yeah. Yes. So yeah, so no. The answer is unfortunately no. Oh yeah. Yeah.
It's just completely different, and what they make at the same sort of careers is completely different.
Yep. No, that. I think there should be. I think there should be some balancing scale that has some sort of metric. Yeah. Yeah. Plus housing costs. Like I mean, yeah. Because we know like $80,000 here and $80,000 in the Midwest is nowhere near the same thing. So, but yeah, unfortunately.
And was there something, I feel like I heard a couple years ago where there was like income kind of cap, and if you were under it, you could get free tuition in state?
There are programs that will cover, they're usually considered a sliding scale type of program. Basically, at a certain threshold, it essentially is free for tuition. Tuition, to be honest, at most universities in California, even community college, UCs and CSUs, is relatively low, comparatively. The big cost is actually your room and board. I mean, those are going to be the largest costs, even compared to tuition at a UC. And so that's going to be where sometimes like that community college aspect, if they lived here for a year or two and then did a transfer program potentially, your tuition would be free, room and board essentially nothing else, and then like it might offset some of those costs, and so that's a big way to save a lot of money. There's some trade-offs, but like typical first year high school student or college student experience in the dorms and things like that sometimes get sacrificed, but yeah. It will provide the FAFSA itself actually only gives this number called the SAI to colleges, and the colleges are the ones that actually award dollars, and so they figure out how they're going to meet that need in that calculation of how much is left after financial aid and figuring out where that's going to come from, and that's where we kind of get hosed sometimes, where we get stuck with this big amount left over. But we'll take a look, and some of these tools we'll talk about will be really helpful. All right, a lot of seniors. It's got the small crowd right now, which is cool. So we're gonna dive in. Maybe I can like have some audience interaction. I can ask you for some numbers and we can plug stuff in when we play with a few things. But like I said, we're gonna dive into kind of the second half of tonight, and we're gonna get into a little bit more of how do we do some things maybe a little earlier, a little bit before we're ready to submit an application and get ready to actually do the process of financial aid. And so just a reminder, this is not, don't go and say like, well, Mr. Ream told me I should do this with my 529. Like that's not what I'm saying. Always ask the experts. But this is kind of the roadmap that we're going to spend a little bit of time talking through. So we're going to go through some net price calculators. We'll pull up a couple and actually work through them. We'll plug some numbers in, take a look at it together and show you what the outcomes look like. We might dive a little bit more specifically between the FAFSA and the CSS profile and hit on what they look at and don't look at. Loans and scholarships, we'll take a little bit of a deeper dive into that topic, cover some of the stuff to be aware of there. What we need to do early on, so like 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th grade, before we kind of dive into the whole process and award cycle, how to reduce some costs, and then take a look at some financial aid award letters as well. So net price calculators essentially plug that cost of attendance. They use a formula to calculate what your essentially SAI, your student aid index, that's the number that the FAFSA provides as a result. And then they use some basic math. It's kind of like if you went on Kelley Blue Book and you plugged in how much is my car worth based on a couple factors. It's going to give you a rough estimate. Probably is not super great. It's going to give you some basic tips to move forward with finding out how close or how feasible a college might be for you. So to use those effectively, we're going to pick some sample schools ideally. So these are schools, like if you're in 9th grade, pick a couple different schools from different levels, like a CSU, pick a CUC, pick a private college, pick a community college, compare some of the different options and results and resulting costs, and determine which one makes the most sense. Okay. If you're a little bit later, you can actually pick some schools maybe you've started to gain some interest in, maybe schools that are starting to populate lists, and actually get a deeper dive into schools that maybe you want to attend down the road. It's helpful if you're filling these things out to get a best apples to apples comparison to actually use similar numbers between the different tools. If you plug in fake numbers and use wildly different numbers, you're going to get wildly different results. Okay. And then compare results and then maybe make some recalibrations. Like, hey, what happens if we got a raise? What happens like if this happens? Or if we sold this piece of property, like what would happen? Like kind of you can game it a little bit to figure out what the impacts and pros and cons of making some decisions about finances could have some impacts related to how much colleges offer you. So this is where I'm going to pop over. So we're going to take a look at 2 primary ones. Okay, and it only takes a couple minutes to actually run one. Okay, so this is for UC San Diego. So give a UC example. So we'll hit start a new estimate. Yes, I agree. We're just going to pick some random date. Not in 2025. Pick like 2018. And then you can indicate whether you're a DACA or a dreamer. So those are students who maybe are here with some status, international student. Many times that would be considered someone who is maybe undocumented or students who have citizenship in another country, or most commonly this citizen or permanent residence. And then this is where you'll also indicate which state. If you live in Nevada, they have Nevada on the state list and you can plug that in as well. We'll hit next. These are going to be things that most high school students are not, hopefully. Hopefully not a parent, hopefully not yet married, all those fun things. You might be there might be a question that you could potentially see on some that might be like, I'm a dependent of someone in the military or on active duty. Or if, for example, if you're a senior and you did the FAFSA already, you might have some information that's helpful. But realistically, at that point, we're probably past some of these steps. We'll indicate whether a parent is single, which would be considered like if you're legally divorced, not married, things like that, or married or remarried. How big your family size is. This is very commonly, and there's usually question helpers over here too. Family size is usually everyone in your family, so that would include parents, students, and any siblings. There might be some specific information they include related to like, hey, do you care for a grandparent or an aunt or uncle or another family member, things like that. Sometimes those are considered in some of these calculations and sometimes they're not. So we'll just plug in 4 for fun. There'll be 1 student enrolled in college. We'll just make up, give me a number. It's like Price is Right. Spit any number out. 90,000. Okay. Let's say we said these parents were married, so let's spit out another number for this one, just for fun. 80. Okay, awesome. Okay, we're going to hit this. It's going to ask you oftentimes a little bit of details about your checking account circumstances and any investments potentially. So say we have yes, we'll just say $4,000 just for fun. If you own a small business or a farm, if you own investment properties, typically outside of your main primary household. So this would be like if you have a rental property, you would potentially hit yes there. This is the students. So financial aid includes student financial aid as well. Okay, so when you have to kind of pay attention when it's asking whose financial aid is, whose income or money is it talking about. So we'll just say like, hey, I worked and maybe I saved $2,500, not 25,000, or that's how much. And then I have this, $400 in my savings account. We'll hit yes. Where am I in the enrollment process? That's probably the specific application I'm just researching. And we're going to hit next. It's going to confirm it. And then it will calculate and ask, are you going to live on campus or off campus? And then this is going to be something like, for example, if you live in Nevada and go to school in California, you may be eligible for this program called AB 540. It's a little bit of a loophole. It's geared towards undocumented students, but being that we're in kind of a unique environment, we do have students that I've known take advantage of this program by becoming essentially the equivalent of an in-state student by meeting the different qualifications of this bill. So you can hit yes or no or not applicable. And then it's going to spit out a scary number most likely. Okay. So there's a couple things that are great about these tools. There's a couple things that are not great about these tools. And one of the things that you'll notice too, between when we look at something like UC San Diego and maybe another one that will be more of a private school institution, they're going to have a little bit more limited offering initially about things like eligibility for some maybe Cal Grant qualifications and stuff like that, because sometimes they need additional information about like GPA or what type of, like which school you're going to, and different details that they might not gather on an application like this. So sometimes these grants for places like UCs are going to be left roughly blank. This income could potentially be above the threshold for some of these awards as well. So there's some things that you have to be aware of there. The other thing that doesn't really do is it doesn't really consider some of the different like UC programs, like the middle class scholarship, the blue and gold scholarship, things like that will often not show up on something like this, but it could show up on an award letter later. Okay, so it does provide some good information, whether it's scary or not, but it gives you some numbers to kind of start with. It's a ballpark figure, and it's decent. And you can see here, right below the direct costs, that's the stuff that basically gets billed to the school. Your tuition and fees is basically the same amount as your housing and food, okay, as their estimate. And so, like I said, I think you had a question about like how do we reduce this? Like community college is a great avenue because like the tuition goes down. This housing and food, if you live locally, is nothing additional to what they already cost you. And so there's not added costs involved. And so sometimes doing that path can be a really, really heavy help in terms of making school more accessible. You can do it by term. Sometimes, depending on the program, you can maybe do a total degree, which basically multiplies this by 4, which is a scarier number. Okay, so these are great tools to start looking at. Again, it's very much ballpark. Don't read too much into it, but gives you a sense of where your standing is. This is a great tool as well. We had a couple schools from the STARS network, which is a group of schools out there that came and visited us back in like September, October, and they went through a session with a lot of our seniors and some students related to this. And this is another great tool that provides a number of different colleges down below. These are many of our highly selective, highly expensive, hoity-toity types of schools. So part of the challenge of some of these is actually getting in. That's kind of hoop number 1 to jump through. But realistically, these types of schools, they're gonna. So I think I pulled up WashU, for example, Washington University in St. Louis, and so they have some tools, and this is just an example of one. But I like to show a private school example because a lot of times when I have these initial conversations about financial aid with families and students, private schools are like, oh my gosh, those are like $90,000 a year schools. Like, why are we even thinking about those schools? And in reality, for most families, it's nowhere near that. And so a lot of times, excluding private schools from the mix is actually a mistake initially until you can get a better sense of if it's a good fit, if it is a financial viability by doing stuff like this. Okay, because they're actually, they have a lot more buckets of money to dig their hands into, to pull out, to offer to students who they want to attract. Okay, so let's take a look at this page here. And so we'll kind of plug some of that same information in here and do a little bit of a comparison. So my intuition, we're going to say U.S. citizen. It's going to ask a little bit more detail than some of the more basic UCs and CSUs. This is kind of like a little bit more CSS profile-y compared to maybe FAFSA. So it's going to ask who you live with. I think we've said both parents the last time, so we'll answer similarly. Do you have any siblings who'll be in college? I think we said no last time. We said yeah, none in college. We'll enter family's total income, which what do we say? We said 170 grand total. If that's right. Does your family own the home you live in? We'll just say yes for fun. Any cash? I think we said. And then it'll ask sometimes about retirement stuff. Again, that's a little bit different between CSS profile schools, which WashU is. Most of those schools on that last page will be CSS profile schools. So we're just going to say no for this purpose right now, just to kind of give a more apples to apples comparison. So where it's going to ask you how expensive your house is in Tahoe. We were talking about that as well. Of the unfortunate thing about when we're looking at both this process and the financial aid process is there's not really any major consideration in terms of cost of living in particular areas that's accounted for. Okay, we were talking about how the salary here and the salary in Missouri are very different types of money, right? So like the cost of living is very different. We'll just throw a low level average Tahoe house on there. And we'll just, say like, I don't know, 350 for fun. I think we said $4,000, I think, last time. And then we'll get results and see what happens. Okay. So this kind of gives you a low ball estimate, best case estimate, and more of an average estimate. And so what this kind of gives you a summary of, average cost of attendance, a whopping $98,000 per year. Okay. But one of the cool things, so they're basically going to say this, that your family can afford, and this is primarily going to come from probably your housing estimate, is a $48,000 a year whopper bill. Okay. If that number, both your income and or potentially if you don't own a home or things like that, if that went away, this number would probably shift a lot more to need-based scholarships and grants offered by these institutions. But ultimately, that is not all that different than you see out the door. And there are a couple benefits that you'll notice between private schools and state publics. Private schools are very motivated to get students in and through their program in a timely fashion. They also typically only admit students they know they can actually do that with. Where CSUs, UCs, they have a goal of that, but they also have a goal to meet expectations from places like Sacramento and legislators to admit as many possible students that can fit on campus, which sometimes you'll see extending degree paths into 4.5 or even 5-year degrees for a bachelor's degree program. And like I said, that 4.5 or 5th year is not free. Okay, so it can very easily potentially move the cost of attending a UC above the cost of potentially attending a private institution somewhere else, where the actual net price is not actually what you see listed on their website necessarily. And this can actually go very different. If your income was fairly lower, I think I played around with earlier yesterday or the day before, and I think I didn't include how, like I didn't say I owned a home, for example, and the income was fairly similar, and it was free. It was all covered. Okay, so they have ways to support this. So that's what I say when I say don't just exclude the very expensive schools right off the bat, just because of that sticker shock. Keep them in that mix. It's good to have diversity. It's kind of like investing in a stock portfolio. If you put all your eggs in one type of school, you're only going to get all types of results. All private schools, all private school money. All UCs, all UC money. If you diversify, you're going to have some different choices and opportunities to explore different types of financial aid. Just to give you a cross comparison, most community colleges don't actually have a net price calculator because the prices are generally stable. Okay. But you can generally see roughly what an average cost of attendance would be. Now, this is Cuesta, so down in San Luis Obispo. Tuition is roughly $46 a unit for 28 basically units in a year. That's only about $1,300. So tuition at community college is relatively low. And like I mentioned earlier, there's actually programs that actually even cover that cost. Okay. So the biggest cost of going to community college is going to be your living expenses. They put this number in here. That's kind of like you're already paying that. So it's not necessarily additional per se if they're living at home. Okay, they obviously take up space, they eat food, use gas, things like that. But like generally speaking, you're not shelling out for another apartment or additional food bills or another car insurance payment. Okay, that would be more like this. And so you can see the vast majority is going to be coming from room and board. So if you want to save the most amount of money possible and going to a school that's maybe a little bit of a stretch financially, this is a really good avenue to explore more of, and can create many opportunities as well, especially if your student is maybe a little bit like under the typical student portfolio or profile for a given institution. Attending and going through a community college can actually reopen doors potentially that may have kind of like been harder to open during high school. Okay, so that's just another example of what it could look like from. So anybody have any questions or want to look at, have like a burning desire to pull up in that more specific fashion to some degree. Yes. In that more specific fashion to some degree. Yes. Oh, okay. Hopefully it's working. If not, I'll re-record this all in tomorrow. It's been known to happen sometimes. Cool. Well, we'll keep on moving on. There's a bunch of other cool stuff that we'll kind of dig into and kind of talk through a little bit. So we kind of hit a little bit of this stuff earlier on in the first session, so I'm going to gloss over and just remind us. So I think the main one is just digging into some of those sometimes uncomfortable conversations about money. That's not a typical family conversation. Hey, let's sit down and have dinner and like let's talk about how much or how little we have to help you pay for college. That's sometimes not the greatest, most looking forward thing, probably second to the birds and the bees conversation like that you have to have with a teenager. But it starts to become more and more important. They need to be more aware of kind of like what resources do they have access to, or do they not have access to help support their process. When students go to college, everything that they borrow, with the exception of the Parent Plus loan, is in their name. So when they are going and making college decisions, they have to go in there kind of with some degree of kind of like full disclosure, right? So if we're not telling them about something that's going on with our finances, it might actually set up a student to borrow more than they need to, or take money that maybe they don't need to take out, and then set themselves up for some challenges later on if it doesn't need to be that way. Financial aid reporting, that number 2 there. So FAFSA looks at what's called the prior year. I have another slide that will talk a little about this, but what that means is for this year's seniors, for example, their FAFSA form is always going to be dated with the year that they're going to be in college for. So that's sometimes a confusing factor, because they'll be like, oh, it says FAFSA 26, 27. We're not even there yet. I don't know what you're talking about. Like, it's for the school year that the student will be getting ready to go into the following year after graduation or in their next year of college. The prior year means that if it's the 26, 27, it's going to be using the 24 tax information. Okay, so basically my way of thinking about it is it's the year that we already have done when we're a senior year. Like in their senior year, we're still working on 2025. That's closing in a couple weeks, and then we'll file those in February, March, and April. Okay, so that's kind of the way to think about it. The challenge is things change, right? People lose jobs, get new jobs, family circumstances change, all that stuff happens. And so that's not taken into account right away, but there are avenues to potentially address changes in circumstances that happen between when you actually have to report the information from your taxes and the actual filing year. But it does get a little tricky. So we talked through this. One of the things that I'm not going to go too in depth in this, but these are going to be ways that potentially, with maybe some advice from like a tax advisor or financial planner or someone who's really good at numbers, like other than me, that you might explore, especially, so like right now, just to give you a sense, this year's sophomores, starting in January, that is the first year of tax information that they will utilize to determine their freshman year financial aid award. Okay, so anything that needs to happen in that particular grade should happen in the next 2 weeks. If you don't want it to, but again, if you make changes, like again, it's always this lag time, right? So any changes, like maybe I made a ton of money one year and then not a ton of money, which happens in Tahoe, right? You're in business and like snow doesn't fall and you make nothing, and the snow's awesome and you make a ton. Those are the types of things, like you might have a great year and it kind of sucks in the financial aid aspect, but then like, hey, the next year was really bad. It will catch up, and there are some avenues to like address some of the variability with financial aid offices, but it's just really important to understand a little bit more about it. Yeah, so the 2026 tax year is the primary year for ninth graders. That'll be the 2027 tax year, which will be the first impacted year for applications in that freshman year of college, and then years there forward. So some general advice, not a financial planner, about maybe how to look about and understand a little bit about what assets are included on financial aid applications, in particular the FAFSA. Okay, so assets that do not count. Okay, so this is going to be your primary house. Okay, so where you live as your primary residence. Certain retirement accounts, a couple examples are up there, will not be factored into what they consider income. cash value of any life insurance plans, and any annuities you might have. So those are sheltered from that calculation to determine. And many of these other things also have a proportional component, right? So like certain things are only going to be like, they're going to take 5% of this value and add it to your total income. Like it's not like, hey, like I have a rental property and it's worth $1 million, like magically you have $1 million. Like they're going to take a percentage of that value and plug it into their calculation to get an overall picture. Some assets that do count that you'll have to pay attention to, checking and savings accounts. People ask me, what does that mean? Like, so literally on the day that you, technically according to what the rules say, you are supposed to look at your checking account, write the number in on the day you hit submit. So what does that mean you do the day before? Yes. You buy the thing that you needed, like, yes. So again, in the most legal way, you know, that's the true nature of that question, is how much, as of today, when you're submitting this document, is in these two accounts? And you just accurately reflect that. Taxable investment accounts, stocks, bonds, mutual funds are included in some of that stuff. Typically, that's going to be pulled from tax information. So like your tax filings will typically reflect that. Real estate investments beyond your primary home. And business equity, that's a little bit more tricky. For a year or two, they actually removed an exemption that small family businesses, which is typically in the family's name less than 100 employees, that impact was not included. They removed that for about 2 years, and they just put it back. So it should not weigh in if you own a small business and have less than 100 employees and it's owned by your family at 51%. It should no longer, going forward, have an impact on that amount that you're considered for. So a couple other ideas about how to potentially strategically get yourself ready for some of these things. Things like home repairs. Like if you're waiting to re-roof your house, it's a great way to get money out of your bank account. Or potentially looking at investment structures, moving a couple things around. This is a super important note. Never improperly move things around. Okay, when you file the FAFSA, you are agreeing to the federal government that everything is true and accurate. They also, with the new FAFSA, it's a little more streamlined. They verify this stuff. So if you type stuff in and be like, oh yeah, they will actually select some students for verification, meaning like, okay, show me your bank account, show me your investments. Like, and it's a small subset, and it's less common now because they're actually pulling information directly from the FAFSA, where in the good old days, you would actually type it all in, and they kind of just took your word for it. They would select some people that randomly, monitor, and they would check to make sure that it's still accurate. So if you fudge some numbers, it doesn't always end well in that sense. Okay, so those are some really important ones just to be thinking about. And that's most impactful, like I said, before your tax window starts hitting in relation to being eligible, which is kind of like usually by about the end of your 10th grade year, middle of your 10th grade year. Families also sometimes have kind of some non-traditional circumstances, and there's various iterations of what that looks like. So the most common one probably will be divorced or separated parents. And in the past, before a couple years ago, with the new FAFSA that has recently rolled out, they used to consider who the student lived with primarily, essentially the custodial parent who spent 51% of the time with or more. That is no longer the case. They now consider who supports the student financially the most. They could live 100% with the parent one, but potentially that parent one has a much lower income and maybe receives things like child support or other ways of supporting from parent two. That parent two would be considered the contributor if that money outweighs the money of parent one. Okay, so it's a little bit more complicated than it has been. Used to be, we would just say like, why don't you just go live with so-and-so who makes less money and it will save you a lot of money. Like that might be an option. Nowadays, that's not so much the case. Okay, if it's literally half and half, then it's usually the parent with the higher income. So it does become important to kind of start tracking expenses to some degree. If you have a split family and like who's paying for what, like if they're paying for ski team and you're doing this, like kind of start keeping ledgers of kind of like some of that information, because that might become helpful when you're filling out some of these documents later on. The CSS profile rules, different schools will have different requirements. I'll just show you an example. literally, if you want to know what schools are out there, you just type in CSS profile schools. It'll pop up this list of schools. And this is kind of the list of all the schools. And then what you'll see here is we'll have domestic students, and then they'll say, yes, under this one, this column requires non-custodial parent documentation as well. Okay, and so that is something to also be aware of, and some schools require it and others do not. Most students who are in high school are not independent students. That's actually a very hard thing to do. A lot of times students will ask, well, like, can I just emancipate myself? It's like, no, it's not how it works. It is like independence, like most of the time it's like foster care, circumstances like that. Okay, and so there's very specific ways to do it. It's really not like, I just don't want to be under my parents' roof anymore, so I'm going to go to the court and they're going to emancipate me that way. It's a different kind of independence. And then families, small businesses, we kind of touched on that. If there's any military families, there's a lot of other resources also available for students and their families in relation to paying for college. We don't have a ton of military families go through, so we don't always kind of spend a lot of time on this one, but if you have questions about that, we can always dig in deeper to it. So I kind of give you a little bit of an overview about student loans, but there are, like I said, 3 primary buckets of student loans. We didn't really talk about private loans earlier. We talked about the federal student loans and then the PLUS loans. But ultimately, there are a couple strategies to use when you do get offered, and most students will get offered loans. It's just the fact of the matter. It's like how the system tends to work. Going from left to right on the screen, that is the order of operations of taking out loans if you do need to borrow money. Do not go right to left. Okay? Federal student loans typically are dispersed either through the federal government or the school's name itself. They're sheltered, they're capped at certain things. There's a lot of rules and regulations to it, both the amount of loans that you can actually take out, but also the interest rate, repayment plans, protections for students. Those are all really like helpful things to be aware of. They're completely accessible through the FAFSA or the DREAM Act. They have a cap. Repayment, like I mentioned, usually begins after students leave college, meaning they matriculate, and that, again, may even be a graduate school type of program. They do offer, and these are kind of like in flux still, like every year it seems like they're changing a little bit, but they have flexible payment plans as well. They might have income-based plans where, like, if you're early career, you might pay a lower bill, and then as your income likely increases as you get more experience, then you pay based on kind of like a sliding scale. The PLUS loan is, like I said before, a parent loan. So it's actually a loan that you as a parent, essentially like a co-signer, but it's realistically you are signing all the documents, you're taking the loan out and basically providing it to your child. They do have a credit check. It's not so much like a, what's your credit score type of a check. It's really more of an they call it an adverse history check, where they're going to look for things like bankruptcies, like big things usually. But it's something to be aware of. They have a higher borrowing limit, okay, meaning you're going to be able to borrow more as an adult, usually with an income and things like that. They usually start their payments right away. Those payments are typically not deferred. Okay, so, and then the interest rate is also fairly high. This is probably about 7%, between 5 and 7 on a given year that it gets recalculated. This is about a 9% interest rate. And they have an origination fee as well that has to be paid right. It basically gets taken out of the loan and paid to whoever. Private loans, that's gonna be your Chase Bank, your Wells Fargo type of bank. They're gonna come with very, very high, I mean, you're talking 25, 30% interest rates, very like limited consumer protections. Like it's, if you need this, that's usually like, okay, that's all right. If you need this, it's like, you might wanna think about it a little bit. If you need this, it's probably not the school for you. Okay, that's my like 30-second litmus test of using loans, because you get into private loans and that's where you get in the news, having $300,000 debt for that history degree. Like that's not a fun place to be. When you borrow, definitely look at those interest rates. If you do have to get that far, just like buying a car or a house, you can shop around for some of those different resources. The 2 primary ones have set rates, so that's the benefit there. Checking loan calculators, that might be a good activity as you're kind of like talking to kids about finances and family finances as well. Like talk about like, hey, when we bought this house, when we shop for this car, we had to figure out like, what is the actual cost we're gonna pay? What's the return on our investment? These are long-term things. Most repayment plans are about a 10-year repayment plan, ideally. But it varies. If you're making the minimum payments, it might not be 10 years. It might be 15 or 20. Okay. And so it's really important just to be aware of kind of knowing what they're getting themselves into and trying to reduce the cost where we can. And then ask questions. There's a lot of financial aid professionals out there who are their entire job is to answer questions and help students make good decisions. Like once again, kind of like admissions officers, they're not denial officers. They're not trying to like get your student out of college. Same thing with financial aid professionals at colleges. Like they're trying to help where they can. There's limits to what they can do, and they're not going to try to like loan shark you and things like that. They're going to try to help you access the money you might be eligible for. Yeah.
How does the payment going to the university work in terms of timing? If it's looking at that $40,000.
It usually depends. Some might offer an upfront. You just cut a check right there and you cover the whole year. Others might be, so like this, if this is coming from you, kind of like a bill that maybe you have to pay. And then I'll cover the ones like if we borrow a loan, how does that work as well? But like most typically you probably have a term bill, essentially like your first semester is this much, your second semester is this much. And then they often have some sort of payment plan with usually fairly low or no like interest impact or anything like that lets you just pay over like a month. Like you pay monthly instead of like semesterly. If you borrow money, that money typically will get dispersed primarily to the school. So for example, if you borrow a federal student loan, that money is primarily probably going to go to cover your tuition first. And so you're not going to typically get the check for that loan amount for that. That'll just go direct. It's like a discount coupon code, essentially. However, there are circumstances where if you're getting maybe more student aid than maybe your what they call direct costs are, how much the college might bill you, then you get a check cut to you. So if you get some sort of financial aid of $30,000 that might include loans, it initially goes to direct costs to cover what that you owe the school, and then if say there's $7,000 left over, you get a check for $7,000 that your student does that covers. A lot of times that's for like food, that might be for some of those miscellaneous expenses that they talked about in the cost of attendance component. So that's going to be a heavily variable thing. Financially is super family and student specific as well. So like every school is going to look a little different. Every family circumstance is also going to look a little different. Does that kind of hit the question? Maybe I'm misunderstanding.
No, I think so. It's more about regardless of any loans, what's the expectation for paying the school?
Yeah, so yeah, they're going to have their own individual kind of. There's not like a cookie cutter policy. I would say probably the most common one would be kind of like by term. They'll offer you they'll split the $40,000, 20 grand type thing, and you'll split those in half most typically. So scholarships, we kind of dove in a little bit to this earlier, and we'll dive a little deeper. So institutional scholarships, those are going to be the ones offered by the college themselves. Usually they might call them merit aid. Sometimes they even call them merit grants. And so different schools will have different structures and kind of processes to make these available to students. More and more these days, true institutional scholarships that I'm seeing are things that students generally are automatically considered for in their freshman year. They're automatically considered through their application for a lot of the freshman year scholarships from institutions. There may be scholarships that then open up for additional students going forward, that once you're a student there, then you can potentially apply for upcoming years. Those might be departmental scholarships, maybe some additional types of scholarships they may offer. But less and less am I seeing individual schools saying like, not only do you have to do this FAFSA, your application, but now you have to like scour through the college website to find these obscure scholarships and do their stuff for that. Very rarely now is that a ninth grade thing or like an incoming freshman thing for college. But those are going to be variable in terms of money requirements, expectations. When we're looking at scholarships as well, one of the best ways to kind of like increase your opportunities is think about what about you might be a little more unique. Maybe you're part of a community. Maybe you're maybe you have 11 toes. I don't know. There's probably a scholarship for someone with 11 toes. Those types of like the goal is to kind of reduce the potential pool of applicants that you're kind of competing against to some degree where we can. And so sometimes that might be that's where regional scholarships come into play a little bit better. Local scholarships even more. Instead of 10,000 students vying for this couple scholarships, maybe it's 100 now. So those are some of the different things. Faith-based organizations, looking at jobs or corporations. If you work for a corporation, sometimes they have scholarship stuff set aside for maybe students of their employees. Those are all great areas. But just historically, like I said before, when students are filing FAFSA, the true scholarship dollars that we mostly see are coming from our local community. That's the true return on the investment for a vast majority of students. I hit most of these already. So some differences between the FAFSA. I'm not gonna cover this one. I'm gonna spend a little bit more time on that side. The CSS profile is that separate application. That's gonna be the small subset of schools, and they are going to take into account a lot more areas. The timing is the most important difference here as well. And the CSS profile is usually something that's tied more to an admissions process than the FAFSA actually is. So very commonly when you're applying as a senior, both are senior year processes, but more typically this is like that broad window. You can kind of file most often between October and March and usually be pretty good. This one usually is due within a relatively small window of when a student's freshman college application is also due. So usually this happens much earlier in the season. So if a student is looking at some of these schools that might be on that list of 200, 300 schools, this is a very important piece of information to keep an eye out for. Okay, because if your student is applying, say, early action, early decision, and they're crunching through their applications as a senior to get that November 1st deadline done, which is here before we know it, that also typically is done right at that time or like within a week or so following that application. And this is not a, we'll sit down and do this in a 30-minute thing. This is a, let's set aside the weekend and get this done thing. Okay, so it's something just to be super aware of that sneaks up on people because it's not required for all schools. That's another tricky one too. Anything on here that I feel like is super crucial that I didn't already touch on? I will, on this page, I will just mention the FAFSA in California is a loose California graduation requirement. I say loose because there's an opt-out form as well. Okay, but when students get into their senior year, we will hound them. And that's how important California feels that it is. They've actually made a law that says students will either file their FAFSA and provide proof to us that they have done it, or they will file a formal form that they submit to us saying like, we know that's a rule, but we're just not gonna do it. It really is something that they wanna make people aware of. So it's really not high pressure thing. Like if you're not gonna do it, then we just have you sign a quick form and that's it. But it goes to emphasize the importance of filing some of these documents. We talked about community college. We talked about the WUI. Sometimes honors programs at colleges also have some dollars that come with it, and also other kind of tangential support pieces. Things like priority registration. Maybe like they provide you with a new computer. They might provide you with specialized academic advising. Some of those things that maybe help you along the way. So if they're some of them are highly competitive, other ones are a little bit broader. So if you're applying to different schools, check out what those different honors programs or honors colleges on campus might create access for. Other things that you might find on campus too, for example, at the CSU system, they have a program called the EOP, which is the Educational Opportunity Program. And that is a support program similar to like our GRIT program that we offer on campus, which supports primarily first-generation students in accessing college, but also navigating highly complex systems. And so they offer that similar type of program in college, and sometimes that actually also comes with some financial aid support or access to resources on campus that might be helpful to sometimes offset college expenses. Comparing aid offers, which I think was where we're about to get to, is kind of the tail end of this process. Like I said, we kind of reverse shop in the college world where we figure out what we want and then we figure out how much it costs versus finding out how much it costs and then figuring out which one fits us. Okay, so when we actually submit the applications, get the awards, then we will actually get this thing called a financial aid award letter. They still call it a letter. Very rarely do you actually get a letter. It's usually an email or a portal thing that you'll look at. But it usually kind of follows a similar structure to a letter. Okay, and it's going to spell out some of the stuff we've been talking about, like your cost of attendance, how much gift or self-help you need, and then your overall net price. So let's take a look. I'm going to open up some of this. It's going to be fairly small. I'm going to try to zoom in a little bit. See if I can make this happen. Here we go. Oh, come on, you can do it. Why are you going backwards? That does not make any sense. I'm reducing percents and it's making it bigger. So I will read this for you. You cannot see this. I will point you in the right direction. So at the top, and I will send out a copy of these slides if you wanted to take a closer look. Literally, if you Google cost of a financial aid award letter example, there's a ton of things you could check out. But just to orient you, this is kind of what a sample might look like. Up here at the top, it's a summary, right? So it's going to summarize kind of that whole picture. At the top of this, it talks about a $33,000 cost of tuition and fees, a $9,000 cost of housing, total estimated cost of $43,000. Then it goes and talks about the gift aid of $27,000. Then how much is remaining, how many loans they get offered, and then how much other personal costs they might have to submit after that. They break down the different line items, both like loans, they have how much grants, and then you also will have the opportunity to accept or decline different things on these award letters. You won't decline the free money. That's the stuff. There's not even an option. That's yours. But federal work study, these loans, they give you the option to choose. Do I want to take this? Do I need to take this? And also, how much do I need to take? Okay, so like you'll see a line item, that's kind of the maximum that they're offering. If you only need half of that, you can have them adjust that award, and then you accept the amount that you actually need. Okay, and so that's another kind of thing that's tricky about reviewing some of these documents. I have a couple more that we'll take a look at that hopefully will be a little easier to see. Oh my gosh, let's see if maybe doing this fixes it. That's their goal. It will not always get there. And so that remaining amount, if they offer you, like, here's how much you need, and they offer you, say that you need $20,000 more, they offer you $10,000, that remaining $10,000, what they call that is a gap. So if you get gapped a lot, that's where you kind of like have to really start asking those hard questions, like what's the affordability of making this happen, right? And those are the not fun conversations to have as a senior after you got into your dream school and it doesn't quite dollar and cents out. So similarly, it looks a little different. Okay, they talked about how they calculated your need. They talked about the total cost of attendance and broke that down. And then they talked about your award summary. Okay, grants up here at the top, you'll see some loans, and then your total amount. This student met all of their stuff. Doesn't mean that they did left without any loans, but they met their need in this example. There was no remaining gap. And now say if, in this circumstance, this person had an offer of about $2,500 in student loans. If you as a family said like, hey, I saved that over the summer, just don't take out the loan. And you can offset that. So like, again, what you get offered is not necessarily what you have to accept. So like I said, I will send this out. It's much easier to see on my screen with some of the numbers and examples, but there are a ton of them out there. There are a ton of resources out there about finding example financial aid award letters. And when you look at them online through a portal, they look and function very much the same way. They just kind of are presented slightly different, a lot less words. But again, this is kind of like some of the next steps that I would suggest people talk about with your family and really think about taking some time to do. If you haven't started it yet, start keeping track of where that money's at, kind of have those hard conversations. Keep track of documentation too. Especially as you get into that kind of like reporting time frame. So like halfway through 10th grade year is really an important time to make sure that you're keeping your documentation up to date, because you may need to access that in another year or two for that first round of financial aid applications. So sit down together over the break or something like that and pull up a net price calculator and maybe test yourself. What does this mean? What's unsubsidized loan? And maybe ask your student what they think and do a little research. This is your permission to go use ChatGPT for some of this stuff. Like, it's a really great resource. Like, take one of those example award letters, throw it into ChatGPT or Gemini or AI and say like, help me understand this. It'll spit out all the information you need right there. Okay, it's a great resource. to do a little thinking with it, but it's a way to kind of create more connections there. Again, keeping track of those foundational pieces, doing your best at school. That's your best way to make money there. For 11th grade, you're going to be building that list. Start running more consistent net price calculators so that you guys can have more specific conversations around the cost of college and how that means for your family. Get some things on the calendar towards the tail end of 11th grade about deadlines. Usually as you're kind of like refining that college list, finding out college deadlines, finding out when scholarship applications open, when financial aid opens, like putting a calendar together with reminders is very helpful. Because like I said, in NorthTahoe High School, our deadlines are relatively loose. It's like more of a suggestion than a rule. In college, it is a hard rule. It would be a hard awakening for some students, but it is like non-flexible or non-negotiable and not fun if you don't need it. And then ask questions of us. We're happy to help you guys. We have ILP meetings. When we start getting to 11th grade year, we start having more conversations around college in addition to some financial aid components as well. So we kind of work our way through this process along with you. If you have questions about like more complex financial circumstances, there are professionals in the world that work primarily with families who have complex financial circumstances. The only problem is they're usually not free. So like I can do so much in support. Once we hit talking about taxes and like more detailed money stuff, like I have to step myself out of the equation ethically. And so I can't really provide a lot of guidance in terms of like very specific money questions. More about the access, the resources, deciphering is really where I can really support families and students. But the College Financial Aid Office is a great resource. They usually have a direct phone line. Certain times a year, they're busier than others. If you don't get them, call them back another day. You'll eventually get somebody. But if you plan enough of time ahead, you can usually get a hold of someone fairly quickly. I talked about that actually. Okay, so now I get to ask, does anybody have any questions? I didn't let you ask questions at the first one, and you guys have done a good job asking questions throughout. Any questions that I can tackle right now? Kind of. So the question was, are the college applications kind of done at the same time or in the same time frame as like your financial aid applications? Yes and no. So they're separate for the most part. FAFSA especially is separate, totally separate entity, not connected at all. If you don't do the FAFSA, you can still apply to colleges. You just don't get a good financial aid offer. You just pay money. The CSS profile, though, may be more closely aligned with admissions, timeframes, and requirements. For students who are applying for financial aid, they will have typically a much more lockstep time deadline compared to something like the FAFSA. But colleges are happy to have you pay the full price. Like, so I mean, like they welcome full pay families. And so like neither of the applications is actually required to attend college. They cannot create a financial aid award letter without one or both of those applications. Yeah, so that's your avenue to kind of open up those doors.
Is there one CSS profile or is it individual per?
Nope, there's one. So, but College Board will hit you for every college that you got to send it to. $25, $11. Yeah, when you get to senior year, just get your checkbook, your credit card handy because it's once there, bookstore, sweatshirt, yeah, all the things. Okay, but yes, but it's you fill out one application, you select which schools you would like to submit it to, and the FAFSA is the same way. It's a centralized application. You do it one time each year. Indicate which schools you would like it to send it to. And then once you're enrolled in school, you're just mainly updating information, and then you're just sending it back to the school that you're attending. Okay. In the application process, you can indicate up to 20 different schools at a given time, and you can, if you apply to more than that, there's an easy way to add more schools. That's what you'll do until like in the initial year that you're submitting the FAFSA or the CSS profile. Technically, you'll submit it to any school that's on your list, so they have that, so they can make decisions and process your financial aid award should you get in. That way you can make decisions about which schools you want to enroll in. Awesome questions. Yeah.
And for the merit-based aid, those regional information, what are good resources to find out more about?
So those are primarily going to be, sometimes we get notifications here at school. So sometimes the regional organizations will send us like, here, we have a scholarship for your area. Like we'll post it usually either on Google Classroom. We have a little board in the office that we'll post things on as well. But more typically, the regional ones are going to be mostly associated with some sort of like organization. So, like I'm trying to think of, there was like a Northern California, I'm just going to call it the Elks Lodge or something like that, kind of like a larger regional organization that wants to offer scholarships for students from their region. They might send us information, but most of the time it's going to be something that maybe you're already connected with. It could be like I said, a faith-based organization. It could be a philanthropy group, different things like that. There's not, you could find some of those things on places like Big Future. FastWeb is another kind of scholarship aggregate search that you can use. Go Merrily is another one that students could spend some time investigating scholarships, but you have to kind of weed through which ones are kind of more local or regional versus kind of a national pool of students.
The local ones, is it the same? If they come to you?
Local ones, you have to be asleep at the wheel to not do those. Like we will drag you by the ears and make you do those things. And they support a lot of money. So like last couple of years, for about 110 graduates, about half to 70% of who fill out the application, they give about $800,000 to $900,000. So it's a big pool of money, and there are some larger ones, right? So there's some scholarships upwards of $60,000, and there are some scholarships that are a couple $100, right? And they'll fill out one application in their senior year, usually starting in January, and they're usually due at the end of March. And then they get potentially qualified for a lot of different for scholarship programs. They do have some emphasis on need. So like that, one of their main goals for this scholarship group is to meet needs of students going to college. So there is a need component of it, but there's also woven in elements of merit as well. So there's different types of qualifications for different types of scholarships, even within that kind of sphere of our local scholarships. So the FAFSA could influence some merit component. An example of that would be with that local scholarship. We literally call them the Tahoe Truckee local scholarships. That's kind of the language we use on campus. So part of that application is actually submitting that student aid index, that number that you receive from the FAFSA. And that is also numbers that sometimes merit-based organizations will utilize to determine essentially your element of need, if that's something that they're looking at in relation to awarding this dollar scholarship program. Okay, so other areas could be like for example, maybe the WUI. So if you're applying to an out-of-state school and want to qualify for that Western undergraduate exchange kind of tuition discount, you most of the time need the FAFSA to qualify, even though that's not necessarily maybe the main factor that they're looking at to determine if you meet the requirements of the WUI. But it might be part of the process of getting to that phase. And that's most commonly what you see. It's kind of a hoop to jump through because sometimes they might need that to document how they're supporting students, or they might need it for reporting purposes, or maybe tax nonprofit statuses or things like that they might utilize aggregate data around that for. Awesome. Any questions? Awesome. Well, we're going to wrap it up. I want to thank you guys for coming. It's not always the most enlightening, engaging topic of conversation, talking about money and taxes and forms and things like that, but it's fairly important. Hopefully it saves you some money at some point. And then we'll keep talking about stuff like this. If stuff comes up that you have questions about, feel free to reach out to myself or Ms. Django Cohen. We can both help you through the different components. I'm just doing this tonight because I have the seniors, so she'll do it next year. And then we'll kind of take turns, but we're both equally capable of answering any questions that you guys have about any of your financial processes. So hopefully you have a good night. And if I don't see you, have a great winter break. Thank you, guys. And I'm going to pray that my recording worked and I don't have to do this all tomorrow. Okay, cool. I think it is. Thanks, guys.